Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Felix, and I'm here today with the conference's very own Elisabeth Kauffman. Elisabeth is the marketing director for the conference, as well as an independent editor, an author, and an artist. She edits fiction and memoir for independent clients, as well as for publishing companies, and she coaches writers on finding their voices and connecting to the magic in their creative lives. Elisabeth offers workshops for local writing groups on topics such as using Tarot in your drafting and revising process and tapping your creative potential through the visual arts. Welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. It feels so weird to be on this side of the podcast.
I know, it's exciting. It's exciting. I feel some of the pressure's off on this end because you're a known commodity versus, probably most of the people that I interview, it's usually that's when I'm meeting them. So
yeah. Somebody was asking me if I was nervous about this interview, and I was like, no, I know Matthew.
We already talk on Zoom all the time. We'll just pretend it's a normal call. Yeah. All right. Well, it's almost Halloween, and it's no coincidence that today we're going to talk about the Tarot. First, though, we're going to talk about creativity more in general, because this is a subject that both I love to talk about, Elisabeth loves to talk about. And in fact, on Elisabeth's on Elisabeth's website, she has a creative well-being toolkit that I downloaded in preparing for today. And let me just say that website, by the way, is writingrefinery.com, which we'll say again at the end. But so yeah, I took a look at your creativity toolkit, and I have a few questions about creativity that kind of came from that. First off, you start the toolkit with a quote, and the quote is, quote, "Creativity is an act of self-love." So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't really associate those two things. They think of creativity as like something that you do to like write a book or paint a painting. And if you are really good at it, then, you make money at it. And those are the people that should be giving themselves time to be creative. But the truth is that we are all creative beings, and allowing ourselves to have that kind of expression that gets turned off, especially after, childhood, when we feel like we're too old for coloring books anymore. Like, recognizing that you can actually make space for that in your life is self-care, is, like giving yourself an outlet to express yourself, and can be really, really helpful and rejuvenating.
Right. And not only can we give ourselves time to do that, but we probably should, right? All of us, definitely. Like you said, whether we identify as writers or artists or not, I mean, it's just part of the human experience. And I actually like that you mentioned crayons, because 10 years ago, however long ago it was that I decided to take 6 months off to explore my creativity. And I thought I would probably write, but I wasn't sure. And I did. I bought a set of colored pencils, which I hadn't done since elementary school, probably because I'm not a visual artist. And I did. I just started playing around with those. And it was so liberating, even though, again, not a visual artist. That wasn't the point. But letting myself play like that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, like, I feel like so many people, I mean, there's so many cool creative tools out there too, that people just don't, they feel like maybe they're imposters by going to get them, but like the variety of colored pencils that exist. Like, I have this cool set on my desk right now that they're watercolor colored pencils.
Really?
You use them like a regular colored pencil, and then you can add water, and it's basically like a watercolor. And like, that's just super cool. That didn't exist when I was a kid.
Right.
Or, even it might have existed when I was in college and I just wasn't aware of it. But just like a trip to Michael's or the art store, like, you can find so many cool things for adding color expression.
Right. Literally and figuratively. Mm-hmm. So I just gave a talk at the Mechanics Institute because there was a lot of talk about how a lot of creatives got stuck during COVID. For some people, it was the opposite, right? All of a sudden we couldn't go out, we couldn't do all these things. And so for some creatives, it was actually great to kind of have that forced time to get to spend and get to allot to our creativity. But for a lot of people, they got stuck. It had the opposite effect. And so I did a talk about getting out of that creative rut and sort of jump starting your creativity. And you talk about that in your toolkit.
Yes.
So what are some recommendations that you make for people who might be stuck, who might be disengaged from their creativity, and maybe even talk a little bit about why and how we can get disengaged sometimes?
Yeah, well, especially for people who like already consider themselves artists or writers, a lot of time your focus starts to shift to like output, right? And you're like, oh, I'm not writing, or oh, I'm not like doing this thing over here, and that's a bad thing, and you get all like in your head on that kind of thing. When really, like, if you can come back to that idea of play and really connecting to that everything that you do doesn't have to have some sort of cosmic impact, like it doesn't have to be the most brilliant thing you've ever done. Whether, you're a writer and you're just scribbling in a journal, like nobody needs to read that later. It's just a way for you to unlock some of that, perfectionist fear of like, oh, I have to do this thing. No, just put it down and, enjoy the act of creation, even if, your critical eyes might say it's ugly. And the same with like painting and drawing and other things like that, especially, crossing that kind of medium for artists, which writers are considered artists as well, right? Like, for a writer to go and do something that they're actually not as good at, like, trying to draw a picture, that can be really helpful in just kind of giving you space to enjoy the process as opposed to like having to produce.
Right. And getting into a different part of your brain and a different part of your creative mind that then is going to inform probably your writing.
Right.
Indirectly. Yeah. There are a couple of things that you specifically mentioned also about ways to reconnect, and a couple that stood out to me as interesting. One was in your toolkit, you say, drink water. So on the surface, that might sound kind of simple. Like, okay, I've got writer's block and she's telling me just to drink some water. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think, when you're like really focused on an issue, you're like, I can't figure out this plot problem and it is making me crazy. And I've been sitting here for hours and I cannot figure it out. What you're forgetting is that like, you've been sitting there for hours. Like, what other aspects of yourself do you need to take care of in order for your mind and your body to be able to relax and to like open up that space to be creative again? And especially for like people who are suffering from anxiety and depression, a lot of times like you'll get in your head and you're so like freaked out or upset, or just reacting badly to people or things that you see online. If you just like step back and step away, go get a cup of water, hydrate for a minute, then you give your brain and your heart just the space to breathe and be rejuvenated. Because I mean, especially water, it's like it rejuvenates us all the time. We need it.
Fundamental. But yeah, I love that idea that we might be so caught up in the process, usually in our heads, although we try to be in our bodies as well. But yeah, we can get so stuck in our heads that this notion that you just underscored about that we forget the other needs, even those essential needs. And we don't realize that that's detrimental, because I've thought, like, when I was talking about creativity, I spoke to that at the macro level, right? Like, I can't be creative in my day-to-day if I'm not sleeping, if I'm not exercising, if I'm not getting inspiration. Right. So I thought about it on that larger level, but that's really interesting to me and kind of glaringly obvious, but not something like is so often the case though, right? Sometimes the most obvious right in front of our face kind of thing. So that idea that you're ignoring some of the needs that you might have physically, emotionally, on whatever level, I like that. Another one that you mentioned in your list that was interesting, take a break. So just elaborate on that a little bit. Because again, on one sense, it's like, well, yeah, I'm tired, I should rest. But I know there's more to that. So can you speak to that a little more?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of the same concept as like, go get a drink of water, right? It's like, walk away and don't think about it for a minute. Distract yourself by doing something else. Because we spend so much time like really focusing in on, particular problem, especially with writer's block again, where you can't figure out that next step to take in the story. And you get tunnel vision, right? So being able to like really, take a break, walk away from it, find some other thing to immerse your mind in can open that back up. It's why so many writers have like brilliant ideas in the shower, right? Because you're like thinking about something else. You're over there, you're taking a shower, you're, soaping up your hair, and then suddenly you're like, oh, that's the answer to the problem.
To me, that's because I can be sort of a taskmaster with myself. And to me, that's one of the big points here is that we can oftentimes think of taking a break or not working on our projects as being lazy or somehow remiss, or we should be working, we're not working, when really taking the break is part of the process. It's an essential part of the process. And I think we often overlook that.
There's a quote, and God, I can't remember who said it. I'll look it up later and we can put it in the show notes if you want to, but like that a writer is working when they're just looking out the window, right?
Yes.
Like that whole concept of just being able to give yourself space to just like think about what if, and just follow a train of thought that maybe it has to do with the problem that you were working on right then, or the scene that you were working on right then. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just like allowing yourself space to imagine. And suddenly that like comes back to what you were already working on.
Right. Maybe it does. Maybe it is related, but you don't realize it unless you let that organically happen. Because basically, I think a lot of what we're talking about is getting out of the rational mind, right?
Yes.
And accessing the creative mind for lack of a better way of saying it. Okay, so something else. Speaking of getting out of the rational mind and into the creative, intuitive, inspired mind, you have a list of meditative questions that also help us to connect with our creativity. And one of the questions stood out that you suggest that we ponder in order to reconnect. You said, quote, "How does my mindset in this moment encourage or limit creative action?" Let's talk a little bit about how we limit ourselves, because sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Sometimes we're the ones getting in the way, right? And so why do we do that, and how can we overcome that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the why is hard, right? Because like everybody comes with their own baggage and their own set of limiting thought to a particular lifestyle or, activity, whatever it is that they happen to be doing. But like when I think about how I would answer that question for myself, I think about how I really struggled for a long time to call myself a writer, to call myself an artist, because it wasn't a thing that I did every day. And what I realized eventually was that I have this tendency to perfectionism. And it's an ugly tendency because I'm not perfect, like not by any stretch of the imagination. And most of the things that I deliver to the world have glaring flaws in them. But my perfectionist streak comes out in things like when you do like 30-day challenges, or if you do, something where you're supposed to do a certain task at the same time, or every day, or for X amount of time, or X number of words. If I made a mistake, if I missed a day, or if I didn't get the right word count, then my perfectionist mind would say, well, you failed. And so you're done. And so you're not a writer, right? Like if you can't write for 30 days straight or every day at the same time, then you're not a writer. And like, when I could like find my rational way to, hey, that's not true. Like, oh, that's a thing that I think, but not everybody thinks that. And look, there are other ways to approach this. Then like I could let myself be what I want and who I want in the moment. Right.
Right.
Like, I'm a binge writer. When I have an idea, I will spend hours and hours and days on it until it's all out on the page. It's why I love NaNoWriMo so much, right? Because like I can just throw everything at, the page for a while, and then I take a break and I walk away from it. And that's my process. And, somebody else might have I write 500 words, 1,000 words every day, or what Stephen King, right? 2,000 words a day. Isn't that what he says to be a writer? And good on him for being able to do that. But like recognizing that limiting mindset that I had of if I miss a day, then I've messed up and I have to start over, or I'm not allowed to do it anymore. That enabled me to be able to do the thing that I want to do with joy and when I want to.
Right. Right. So at least 3 things in what you were just talking about. I'm going to write down my third thing before I forget. Although I think I already forgot it, but I got 2 of the 3. The third one will come back to me.
It will.
Yes. But so first of all, so I'm fascinated by, because I always have a mixed feelings about, I'm going back to your perfectionism, some of the thoughts that you had on perfectionism. Mm-hmm. And I have a very mixed feelings, or I have mixed feelings about, the word count goals, mm-hmm. Like you said, the 30-day things, because on the one hand, it's good to have goals. Like you have to have discipline, you have to have goals, or it doesn't happen. So there's no question about that. But I just remembered the third thing. But then we can then put that pressure on us, and it can be more about meeting the goal versus just celebrating the creativity. And I always say it's a labor of love. It is labor, but I also do want to enjoy doing it, and I want to love doing it. And so sometimes putting that pressure, I don't know, any other thoughts on kind of the pros and cons to those sorts of goals?
Well, so yes, and right, because there's different parts of the process that matter, and sometimes when you're working on finishing a thing, you need to say, I'm going to have it done by this time or this day or whatever, and you set yourself a deadline, right? But then I work with deadlines differently than some people do too. Like my husband, when he has a deadline, he's like, I'm going to start working on this every day for this much time, and I'll have it done by this time, and I'm like so impressed by that. But for me, I'm like, I have a deadline. Cool. And so then I freak out about it for if it's a month away, I freak out about it for 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks. And then I'm like, okay, let's do it all right now. And then we get it done. And so there's still some discipline in it of when I get to that point, right? Then I do the thing,
right.
And for however long it takes until it's done. And it's just, so yes, having setting yourself goals so that you don't somehow miss completing a thing, that is important. But then if you're just practicing to practice, which it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, of taking some of the pressure off for people who are stressed during the pandemic, that they're not producing marketable material. Well, okay, but if you're so stressed about that you're not doing it at all, then maybe just take some of the pressure off and give yourself the space to do the thing when you are feeling joyful about it, as opposed to oh God, because I have to do it today.
Right. So just to summarize, it sounds like freaking out is a key part of your process.
It definitely is. When I recognized that as well, that was freeing too, because I used to be why am I freaking out about this? And I was like, oh, it's cool. This is the phase of the project I'm in.
This is how I work. Okay. Yeah. Another thing. So thanks for that. Another thing that you touched on that it's just so huge and fascinating. You talked about a second ago how it took you a while to be able to say that you were a writer. And I've told this story before, I think probably on this podcast as well, how first time I met one of my very, very good friends, he asked, well, what do you do? And I said, I'm a writer, and I could barely even get it out. And he always makes this, when he retells the story, as he does whenever we meet mutual friends, he just, curled up into this ball and just made this horrible face. So tell us a little bit about how, because there's no concrete definition, right? Am I a writer when I get published? Am I a writer when I get published in a magazine, or do I have to have a book? Right. If I wrote, it took me 10 years to write my novel. I didn't necessarily feel like a writer most of those 10 years, even though I was spending every spare hour and a lot, of time on that book. So just tell us a little bit about how you overcame and any thoughts you might have on how others can overcome this imposter syndrome that's just so diabolical for all of us.
So I go through stages on it. And I will say, for me, being able to overcome it required therapy, right? I needed to go to therapy, and I needed to recognize the imposter syndrome for what it was, right?
Interesting.
Because my therapist was like, oh, so you're an artist. And I was like, no, I'm not an artist. And she's like, you paint? Yes. Draw? Yes. We have a ceramic studio now. We have yes. Okay. So you're an artist. And I was like, oh God, how do I even begin to, I could feel my throat closing on that. And that, is its own thing. Right. But I'm sure there's somebody else out there that has felt that before, with their art or with writing or whatever it is. Because you set sometimes an impossible goal for yourself in order to allow yourself to become to be called that.
Mm-hmm.
And like being able to recognize that as a thing that you do, as opposed to like what even society does, or people who don't draw or paint, they think you're an artist. How can you allow yourself to embody that thing, especially if you want it so much, right? Like to be able to be in that place. And I have a client, at least one client, who has sent me a manuscript, and they're like, I'm not really a writer. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what is this thing that I'm editing for you right now?
Right. Doesn't it just boil down? Right. Doesn't it just boil down to the fact that if you're painting, you're a painter. If you're writing, you're a writer. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, of course. And then if you're not able to get there, like I wasn't, like you weren't, like so many, if not most of us aren't initially, then I think a lot of it is what you were also alluding to, which is then we kind of have to look at, well, what does that mean to me to be a writer? If I'm writing every day, almost in my case, when I was working on my novel, if I'm writing every day and I still don't feel like I'm a writer, then something is askew with probably what it means to be a writer to me. And I probably need to look at that. Yes.
I think K.M. Weiland just like did a podcast episode on that, on her helping writers become authors thing, where she even talked about the problematic nature of what her website is called, helping writers become authors, as if there's like some magical transition that you go through. But she talked about how, like, if all you do is write in a journal every day and you never show it to anyone, it's not any less important, and it's not any less generative to the world, right? Like the fact that you're doing that makes you a writer. You never have to show it to anyone. And, there's different levels of, joy and freedom in being able to share what you've written with other people. And that comes with its own baggage and its own joys as well. But yeah, the act of like putting the words on the page, that's what counts.
Right. Okay. And another way that you help writers to get words onto the page, and another way that you help writers connect with their creativity is through the tarot. Like I said, this is our Halloween episode. And so we're going to talk about tarot, and we're going to talk specifically about a deck that you created. But first, let's talk about the tarot in general, because it's just so fascinating, especially for people who don't already know and might only associate it with, whatever they might associate it with, the occult. The occult. Yes. So what are the tarot? Just to start off.
So the tarot is a deck that was apparently developed in like the 1500s and 1600s in Italy. And it's really interesting because like there's a lot of like aura and mystery around the tarot, right? Like, and for a long time, there was a group of people that swore that the tarot came from like ancient Egypt.
Right.
And the thing that when I was reading a book by Robert Place on the history of tarot, what he pointed out was that that's impossible because tarot involves cards, which involves paper, which involves like the ability for your average person to have access to paper to be able to make cards and then, use those. So like we have to bump the timeline.
So are you saying that the original tarot were not done on papyrus?
Correct. They were not done
or stone tablets or stone tablets.
Stone tablets either. No, yeah, that's what I'm saying is it was a tool that was developed, and it was actually a card game for a long time too. If you look at a deck of tarot cards, there's a lot of imagery on them, but in general, you'll see like there are 5 suits, and one suit is a trump suit that is special, but then there's 4 other suits, and they're basically like your normal deck of playing cards. They have the royal cards, and then they have the ace, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to 10, and just like a regular deck. So kind of there's definitely crossover there.
Yeah, well, that was a surprise for me when I was researching today, because I'm already familiar with the tarot as well, but I didn't know that they started out as a game. And apparently the game, according to Wikipedia, the game is still played in lots of places in Europe, particularly in Italy and France, I think. What was I going to read? Oh, yeah. But then do you know about when the tarot started to be used for divination?
I think that was, I wrote it down, but I
can help you here. It was the late 18th century. Yeah.
There you go.
According to Wikipedia, the infallible Wikipedia, quote, in the late 18th century, some tarot decks began to be used for divination via tarot card reading and cartomancy, leading to custom decks developed for such occult purposes.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, I didn't realize that they were first a card game in Italy. Trionfi, Tarocchi, and Tarok were the initial games. So I love that. Okay. So thanks for that background. But when did you get interested in tarot?
I became interested in tarot. Let's see. It would probably be 2011, maybe, was when I was gifted my first deck, and there was a woman that was in the area I was living in, Connecticut, who would like do tarot parties and teach you about it. And so we did a party, but it was just me and one other person. And then, and our spouses, who were both humoring us. They're not actually that interested in it. So this woman came to our house and with her decks of tarot, then showed us, interpreted some things for us and showed us how to start reading the cards. And so it kind of snowballed from there.
So if you don't see them from a perspective of divination, what is your kind of how you explain how they, before we get to the writing specifically in your deck specifically, just kind of at a general level, how do we derive kind of insight from the cards?
Yeah. So, there's imagery that's common across tarot decks. And then there's, let's see, how would I explain it? We talk about, I don't see them as divination, just for clarity's sake. What I do not use tarot decks for is to tell the future. Mm-hmm. I don't think that, I don't have the capacity myself to do that. If somebody else out there does, and we can meet and I can learn about that from you, that would be really cool. But I personally don't use it for telling the future. I don't think that's very helpful to me. But I do think it can be really useful as far as tapping into your intuition and learning things about yourself, or kind of revealing things that you might not know you have been thinking, or thought patterns that you have. I have a friend who is actually a Druid priestess and also a psychiatrist. And I did some tarot with her, and the way that I go about it, she likened to doing a Rorschach test. Mm-hmm. I take cards for people and we look at them together. Actually, I like to have people touch the cards themselves, shuffle them, pull the cards out and look at them. And then what I want is to hear what people think, what their first impression is when they see the card, whether they know anything about tarot or not. What do they see? What emotion comes up? What is the first thought that you have? And then we drill down into that, because I feel like it's what we bring to the moment that really gives us insights.
Right. And the tarot are tools to help us figure out what that is that we might not be aware of otherwise. Exactly. And I think that, what are those tests called again? The Roche, what are those tests?
The Rorschach test. Yeah. With the ink blots,
Right. Yeah. I think that's a perfect analogy. Just that idea of what something being evoked because of the image that you're saying, that's giving you insight into what's going on inside. Okay, so let's change gears and let's talk about how you then decided you went from just being interested in tarot to actually doing your own deck. How did that come about?
Well, I have to credit my mentor, Stuart Horowitz, with the actual idea of me doing the deck. He and I had been meeting regularly and just talking about me and my business and my practice of editing and also coaching writers, and how could I express that? How could I express my personal approach to creativity in a way that would really brand me? And so that's kind of where that came out of. And he was like, you should do a tarot deck for writers. And I was like, I should do a tarot deck for writers. So that's where the idea kind of came from. And then really when I jumped into it, I went in thinking about, if I was using a deck of tarot cards, the way that I usually use a deck of tarot cards, but then pointing towards writers and creatives, what would I want to hear? What would I need to hear to help me to be the writer that I want to be, or be the creative that I want to be? And that's where the deck came from.
Okay. Yeah. And we're going to talk about some of that more, because you did a wonderful job. I mean, I was reading through all the cards again last night, and there's just, each card has so much in it, and so much that really is there's no way you can read one of those cards without getting something that you need to move forward. But we're going to talk about that in a second. I want to touch on, though, the artist, because you did the words and somebody else did the art. So tell us who did the art and how you collaborated.
Yeah, I did the words, and then I was actually, Stuart was like, you should do the art for this too. And I was like, there's no way I will ever finish this deck if I do the art and the words. Like, it's just never going to happen. So I was visiting with a friend of mine here in the area that I live in, and she, her name is Jen Gerhardt, and she, I saw some drawings that she had done. She was showing me in her journal, just on the edges of her journal, something that she'd drawn. And I was like, this is beautiful. And I was like, do you want to do the art for this deck that I'm developing? And I gave her some time to think about it, but she was pretty quickly like, yes, absolutely, I want to be involved in this. And so then over the next couple of years, we went, back and forth on, collaborating on getting this deck, bringing this deck into existence. And so I did most of the writing at first, and then I gave her the manuscript and let her spend time with the words. And they're in the book, which I have a copy of right here. There are keywords, so people can use those keywords to help them interpret what they're reading. But she used those keywords and the things that I wrote and the imagery that we decided on together to create the images, the card.
Yep. And I mean, the images really are, they're just beautiful, but I'm really fascinated by, you have an idea in your head, or maybe you didn't have an idea for what you wanted the cards to look like, although it'd be hard to imagine that you didn't already, especially if you're a visual artist. So how do you communicate that with somebody else who's trying to physically render? I've asked this question before. I'm just fascinated by how people who are working with the written world can convey that into, in a way that a visual artist can render it in a way that reflects that vision. Can you talk a little bit about that? It just seems like so challenging.
Well, I get that it is challenging. It definitely is challenging. In the case of working with Jen, I really wanted to give her free reign. I wanted it to be for artistic expression of what was being said there. So as far as imagery, we went with the basics, right? We went with, we decided we used the, in a writer's tarot, instead of having the regular suits of, that go with the tarot of swords and wands and pentacles and cups, we used pens and quills and pages and inkwells. And so when we came up with that, then I just I let her go, because I could be more controlling about it. And some people, with other projects, they have a specific vision, but also if it's not you putting it on the page, you're not going to get that specific vision. You're going to get it filtered through another artist's lens.
That's the point.
So for me, to save sanity for both me and Jen, I was because there's 78 cards in a deck, I was here's what we're starting with. And I've seen what your art looks like. And that I love moons, and animals, foxes and things like that. So I was take it from there. And she would, check in with me and show me what she had drawn, and we would go from there. And for the most part, it was, I think every time I was this is beautiful. That's amazing.
Yeah. They really are. They really are beautiful. You did something else to the deck. So you just talked about how with each of the suits. So can you talk about the other thing that you did to the deck insofar as the layout and the content?
So the other thing I think you're referring to is the fact that the major arcana all are famous authors.
Well, and also the gender related thing. So yes, that was part of it, but the gender was interesting as well.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I'll back up then. Before we talk about the major arcana, we'll talk about in just the regular suits. In the regular tarot, a lot of times in the Rider-Waite tarot, let me be specific, because there's different people who do tarot differently, but in the Rider-Waite tarot and along across a lot of those particular types of decks that are more traditional decks, they have the court cards, which have a king, a queen, a knight, and a like a princess or a page. And usually when you read the descriptions of those cards, they're like, the King of Pentacles is a man who with brown hair and dark eye, like it gets very specific, which I found really weird and a little bit inaccessible as far as like, if I draw the King of Pentacles, like I'm not a man with, brown hair. And anyways, it's just like, it was very strange to me. So we borrowed from another deck called the Collective Tarot, which is a genderqueer tarot deck. And in theirs, they used mentor, artist, and I can't remember the other.
Seeker and apprentice.
Sure, that's right, seeker and apprentice. Thank you. And they use those in place of the court cards, which just opens it up so much more to be able for everyone to access. And we don't need gender to like confer that kind of like importance on us either.
Well, and it just even in addition to that, they're just more appropriate. Seeker, apprentice, artist, mentor. I mean, to the writer deck, they're just even better. That other question aside, but all together, it's just win-win. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the authors and the major.
Yeah, so then in the major arcana, we could have tinkered with those as well as far as like the gendering, because there's empress and emperor and priest and priestess and that kind of thing. But we didn't tinker with those too much. Instead, we just added authors to that. So, and that was actually how the imagery for those cards came about. Was Jen and I went through together and figured out which authors were going to represent each of the major arcana. And then I went through and chose like a work by each of those authors that I felt like was the main reason we were choosing that author.
Mm-hmm.
And then she would listen to them. She listened to the audiobooks for all of the major arcana.
Oh my God. Wow.
I know, it was a really intensive like process, right? So she listened to all of those and tried to put the spirit of that art into her own art. So
I love it. Okay. So let's talk about, so we've got this beautiful deck and all this love and research and intention has gone into it. How do I use the deck?
Yeah. So you can use it any number of ways. There are in the book, there are a few, I'm looking right now because I can point to the page. Oh, but it's not drawn out. So it doesn't matter. You can, if you ever buy the book, you can look in there and it has some suggestions for different kinds of spreads you can use. But the main way that I come to it is if I'm having a problem or if I'm stuck on a thing in my writing, then I shuffle my cards and I say, what do I need to know about this? And then I draw 3 cards. Mm-hmm. And I see what the tarot is telling me about where I'm stuck. Right. Jen actually uses the tarot to really more inform her own writing. And she might be embarrassed that I'm talking about it. So about her process too much, but she does a really cool thing where she draws tarot cards for each of her characters and then thinks about what the properties of that card have to do with the character that she's writing, which I think is really cool.
No, I love that idea. It's that idea of, she probably already knows the characters, but maybe she hasn't drawn out some of what she already knows. And so the cards are likely helping her to do that. I love that idea. And I think it shows how you can be creative with how you use the cards. It sounds
definitely. Yeah. It's not I think I've seen different decks and what they're meant to do is for you to shuffle them and then pull it out. And that's your plot. And that's great, but that's not what I created this particular deck for. This deck is really for people who are struggling with that need to find their artistic voice, with that impostor syndrome that is just hovering over their shoulder and whispering in their ear, telling them that they are not good enough to write, or they don't write enough to be a writer, or their stories are derivative, or, whatever it is that we tell ourselves about the thing that we're trying to create before it's finished. That stops us from it. That's what I created the deck for.
Yep. Okay. So I have a book that's near completion, but that I've been stuck for quite a while. And so I think we need to pull a card.
Okay, let's pull a card.
Give me the insight that I need.
You're asking the deck for...
I'm asking the deck for insight about how to proceed with my current project.
Okay. And here's my deck in case you want to see. I'm going to shuffle these cards. I have been doing, by the way, this cool thing, which I think we're going to talk about at some point, the Kickstarter. But I've been
next. Yep.
Some of the people who donated to the Kickstarter, there are different tiers, and some of them, what they got with their deck was a reading.
Okay.
They do it all virtual because COVID. But it's really cool because, like I was saying earlier, in my process of reading cards for people, I usually like them to touch them. I like them to hold them. And if you're doing a virtual reading like we're doing right now, I can't do that for you.
Right.
You're not holding the cards. But for these people who purchased, like who supported the Kickstarter and got a deck, then
they can pull one.
They pull their cards and we talk about it. So.
Very nice. Very nice.
So I'm going to put my hand over the cards here, and you can see my hand on the cards here. And if you just tell me when you want me to pull one.
Okay.
Pull this one out for you. And here it is.
The Seeker of Pages. Okay.
Pages, which if you know anything about tarot, this one goes with the Page of Pentacles. That would be what that is. Mm-hmm. But you see the Seeker of Pages, first thing that jumps to your mind, what do you...
Well, the first thing that jumps to my mind is there's a fountain on Mallorca where I'm about to go to work on my book, and that I have a very strong association with when I think about going back to Mallorca and going to this kind of quiet, remote fountain that comes out of this big rock. And so choosing that's my immediate association, because reminds me a lot of what it looks like. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's blank pages here. There's the rock wall, like you were saying, that's where you're going, which is kind of a cool
synchronicity.
Synchronicity. And then there's water that's coming out, and it's refreshing. It's giving a drink to these lovely flowers that are there. So like there's like an element of like inspiration, like water definitely symbolizes emotion. And so like there's not a flood of emotion in this card, right? There's not like waves crashing over us. We're not like up to our eyeballs. It's a trickle. It's like the water, the faucet's not off, or if it is, maybe it should, we should turn it on a little bit.
Right.
Give that space for that emotion to like pour out, but not overwhelm us, not drown the flower that's here, but just enough so that it can thrive. And then out of that, you fill the pages that you have.
Right.
If we wanted to, we can look in the book as well and see what it says about the Seeker of Pages.
Let's do it.
And I'm going to flip to the page. The keywords that are there are responsible, supportive, kind. So the Seeker of Pages is a studious, thoughtful, supportive, and goal-oriented person. And how do you embody those things? So what perspective do you feel like that gives you on what you're working on?
For me, it's a big affirmation. It's a big affirmation that I'm going to the right place, that I'm doing what I need to do, which is I need to water. I need to nurture this project that's almost there, that's been almost there for too long. And also just what you said, relative to the water, the project is in pretty good shape. I just need to take the time and have the space to give it that final, input that it needs. And so when you're talking about it's, the water's not overflowing, but it's enough.
Right.
All of that. Yeah. It just feels like a really big affirmation. So
nice. Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Of course.
All right. So you just mentioned Kickstarter. So in the interest of time, although I would do readings all the rest of the afternoon, but
we could have people call in.
We could have people call in. Yeah, we'll have to do a call in. But in the interest of time for now, you just mentioned Kickstarter, and that is another reason that I wanted to have you on. Besides the fact that I love the idea of the deck itself, I also love that you used Kickstarter to do it, because we hear so much, we being authors and creatives, we just hear more and more about Kickstarters. Kickstarter. I'm going to read a few statistics, and then you can tell us a little bit about what it is. But since their launch in 2009, 20 million people have backed a project, 20 million, 6.2 billion has been pledged, and 209,000 projects have been successfully funded. So can you tell us a little bit just about, I mean, I obviously am alluding a lot to what it is, but for people who don't know, can you give us sort of the elevator pitch for Kickstarter?
Yeah, so Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform, basically. And you can fund all kinds of different projects on it. And some are successful and some aren't, obviously. But basically, it's like a no risk way for people to back a project, where they can pledge a certain amount of money. And then if you meet your fundraising goal, based on, hopefully you have a budget somewhere that tells you this is how much it's going to cost me to do this thing that I want to do. Then if you meet your goal, then people's credit cards are charged. But if you don't meet your goal, then nobody loses any money. So it's like, you know, if you were worried about somebody conning you out of money on a particular project and like running away with your $1,000 that you gave them or whatever, this is a way to ensure that that doesn't happen. I mean, they could still fail to deliver on the project afterwards, but I honestly don't know if Kickstarter has a recourse for that or not, but I think they do. They
don't actually. From what I read last night as I was preparing today, they said, you know, we're not responsible for making sure that these people deliver, right? And so I think that when you're setting up, making your case, you just have to you've got to prove that you're legit and that you're trustworthy and show enough of your plan probably to convince people of that.
Yeah, I think there was that somebody in recommending to me how to go about setting up a successful one. They mentioned you need to have a timeline for like people when, you know, after this closes, like what needs to happen next, you know, at each point, and when do you expect to deliver so that people are aware and can be looking out for that. So
right. So yeah, it would be interesting to know if there have ever been any sort of, you know, lawsuits or people trying to chase down people. There probably have been. And I was only perusing the site last night. Maybe I missed something, but I did read a section that really made me think that they're like, look, you know, we can only be liable kind of for our piece of it. We can't make sure that people deliver the product. But let's talk specifically about your product and what was it, just to help people understand even better how Kickstarter can help and why it may or may not be for, you know, good for their project. Yeah. What was it for Luminaria that you thought we need money for X, Y, and Z, and Kickstarter would be a good way to make that happen?
Yeah. So when you think about the self-publishing world, you can get into it for a relatively low cost these days, right? Like, I mean, you know, you need to pay somebody to lay out a book for you. You need to pay somebody to edit a book for you, you know, those kind of things. So there is some cost that's still incurred, but like as far as printing costs goes, especially if you go with, you know, Ingram Spark or you go with Amazon, then like it's a print on demand world. And you don't have to worry about like, you know, having the capital to be able to pay for the cost of printing a first run of the book, because it's just kind of in print until you decide to change the version and go on to something else. So like for most indie authors, like that's pretty awesome, right? A tarot deck is a little bit different though, because like Ingram Spark and Amazon and those other companies, they don't print decks. They'll print the book, no problem. But they don't print decks of cards. So in order to have the book and the deck printed by the same printer and have them available at the same time for people, I needed to go through a boutique printer to be able to do that. And that's not cheap. So the way that I used Kickstarter personally was as like a pre-order. So people who came and backed my project, you know, there were some like, you know, low levels of, if you want to give me $1 or $15 or whatever, then I'll send you a PDF of the book and that's great. But then like for other people, the tiers were that, you know, you got in on the $30 level of here's the, you know, you backed me for the book and the deck. Or you could have other tiers for higher amounts of money that also came with, like I said earlier, either a virtual reading, or like for some people, I picked up personalized crystals and sent them to them. And I think after we hit our goal and we hit a stretch goal, then like we printed journals and sent those to people as well. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that that's a perfect example of the fact that you actually had to do a print run. So you needed a bunch of capital up front in order to do that.
Right.
And that's a great example of why or when it might make sense to use Kickstarter for a project. A couple other things I just want to mention with regards to how it works, because you've talked about, you set up tiers to entice people. You can give $1, you get this. You give $20, you get this. You give $50, you get this. You talked about the timeline. And you also did mention, I guess, that it only funds if you meet the goal. And then what's the percentage that Kickstarter takes? They just take a percentage? Is that
They do, and I don't remember what it is off the top of my head.
But that's the only thing that you pay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So for me, this is less a Kickstarter specific question and more a bigger picture question. So for me, it's hard to ask for help, and it's especially hard to ask for money. So I'm curious, did you have any reservations or any hesitation about that? Maybe you just don't have that issue, but I know that a lot of people do. I know that Amanda Palmer wrote that awesome book, The Art of Asking, which I read when I was thinking about doing Patreon way back when. Any thoughts on that and what you might say, whether you have those issues or not, what you might say to people who might have some hesitations about asking for money? Yeah.
So like in this particular instance, the way that I get around the whole asking for money thing really is that like I had a budget and a bottom line, right? Like, so I knew this is how much it costs to produce each deck, and if we want to make any money off of it, like this is what the markup is. And if I look at like what the general market is for tarot decks, how much people are paying for a deck and a guidebook, then like I set up a budget that way. And it's not that people are just giving me money and not getting anything. Like they can get a literal product for it.
Right.
It's the same as selling a book at that point. Like it's just, it is selling a book with a deck of cards with it. So it's really like what you said, for you, basically you were using it as pre-orders. Right. Yes. That's what we used it for. And yeah, like we had already done most of I think like she only had a couple of cards left to do by the time we did our Kickstarter. So it's not like we were paying for, our utilities even on that. And there's definitely, there are discussions out there in the world about using crowdfunding to pay for, your lavish lifestyle or like whatever it is that people think that they shouldn't be paying for in order to be paying for the work of an artist. And that's a whole other discussion. We could spend hours talking about all the different arguments that go into that. But in this case, for me, it was here's a product.
Right. So there was and sometimes there have been moments in the past where a celebrity who we know or have reason to believe is very well off financially will do a crowdfunding effort, and people will be like, why are you doing this? But then, like you said, it's a complicated, there might be perfectly good reasons why they're also doing that.
Well, and you spoke about Amanda Palmer, who is one of my idols. I just love the woman. Like it definitely, the art of asking like approaches that, like that idea, right? Of like, what are we funding when we fund artists? And,
right. Yeah. And it's a great book. So for anyone who is thinking about doing this and might have a little hesitation, that's a fantastic book to check out. The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. One question about, who were your backers? I'm just curious. And when I say that, I don't mean specifically, but I mean in the sense of, was it like 99% people who were already in your community and you already know, or did Kickstarter really open it up to get supporters from outside of your circles?
Yeah. So I don't know what I expected initially going in, but I was definitely surprised by the majority of the people that backed me. I did not know.
Really?
Really kind of cool. With tarot, especially, Kickstarter, people are on Kickstarter all the time looking for tarot projects to back.
Really?
My favorite, because a lot of people who use tarot cards, enjoy tarot, they're collectors, right? They want to have that deck that nobody else has. They want to like, you know, support artists and emerging voices and other things that are going on. And so we lucked out from that standpoint as well, as that like a lot of the people that purchased our deck are tarot enthusiasts. So they already had some familiarity with the deck. And so then, yeah, that's how that sold. And that's kind of like market stuff too, right?
Yeah,
like,
no, absolutely.
About, like, yeah.
Well, I love that. That's really, really interesting to hear is that, yeah, because I would just sort of assume, I mean, that would be part of my hesitation would be, well, I don't want to just rely on my family and friends necessarily. And I don't even have a specific project in my range. So, I mean, just hypothetically, super hypothetically. So it's really interesting to hear that most of the people you didn't even know. And again, it's going to depend a lot on the niche and the nature of that particular project. But still, it still says, to your point, there are people on Kickstarter looking for projects to support, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So one thing that I love about your Kickstarter story, as we kind of come to a close here, is you didn't meet your goal the first time.
This is
and
true.
yet you decided to do it again. And so again, if it were me, I'm not sure that I would have the courage to say, well, let me try this again. So I love that you did it again and that we're successful on the second time. So two questions, chronological order. One is, why did you decide to try it again? Because the message could have really been, well, there's just not the support for this. So we tried, did our best, you know, let's move on. But that's not what you did. That wasn't the attitude you took. The attitude you took was, well, let's try again. And so then when you did try again and you were successful, what were the lessons? So two parts. One, why did you try again? Two, what did you learn from that second go when you actually were successful?
Well, so when I was doing Kickstarter, when I decided that's how we were going to do it, I made sure to look up as much as I could on like what makes a successful project, right? And there's like a whole bunch of different websites out there that will give you different tips on how to successfully fund your project on Kickstarter. And one of the Universal tips that they had on there is, if you don't fund, try again. Maybe people didn't know about you the last time, you know, like maybe you just didn't have enough reach then. But on Kickstarter, if you don't fund a project, like the people who did fund that project, you still have access to be able to message them through Kickstarter for like a year afterwards. So if you decide to do it again, then you already have like a canned audience that is waiting for you, that you can then message and say, hey, you know, we really appreciate your support last time when it didn't happen. We're trying again. And here's, you know, moving forward. So
that's huge.
That one of like, it definitely says in the literature, like, if you don't do it the first time, try again. And like when you read those statistics before about, you know, the number of projects that have funded versus the ones that have been kick-started in the first place, like the ones that aren't successful, you know, a lot of times they're only one-hit wonders. It's not that they tried, you know, 10 times and they didn't get the money they needed. It's that they only tried it once and then they walked away.
Yep.
There's that. And then like in that was just like this deep desire that I had to get this project out. And I knew that like it had legs. I knew that it was important work that I needed to share, and having that like come to completion. So then when it didn't fund the first time, and given that the advice is to try again, I was like, we're trying again. Let's
try again. But were there any specific lessons from doing it the first time that you did things differently the second time? Or was it enough that doing it a second time, you already had that base and they were able to help you disseminate the word? And
no,
was it
really
just about that?
I definitely did do a couple of things differently. And first I got some feedback from some people who I had met through like Instagram and through Kickstarter. And like through that tarot community that exists in those places. And so I asked them, you know, what they had done in the past that had been successful or what they'd seen done. And they offered different pieces of advice, and some of it I took and some of it I didn't. But like getting some advice from those people was helpful. And then I lowered the goal because I saw what we were able to raise. And I like looked at my budget and I was like, okay, so like if we are able to raise this much and it costs this much more, but like we're willing to like foot the bill on that part of it, like Is that okay? What's our limit? And so then I changed the goal on it to be lower. Mm-hmm. So yay, we funded. And then we actually got to the amount of money that we had set in the original.
Interesting. So what? Interesting. So any thoughts on why that was?
Well, like I said before, like I had that built-in audience already, that platform of people that I could just go to and say, hey, we really appreciate your support and we're trying again. And if you would love to, if you could come and support us again, we would love that. We'd really appreciate it. Right. So there was that little extra reach of people that already had buy-in to the project that wanted to continue that. And then just more people added on top of that, more people, there's more word of mouth by then, I guess.
Yep. Interesting. I love that. So, Kickstarter is just so fascinating. And I love that so many people are able to realize their creative projects as a result of it. Anything in closing, because we are unfortunately out of time, anything else in closing just related to Kickstarter that you might share insofar as for people who are maybe thinking about doing it?
I think ask anybody that you can find that, has wisdom to offer on it. Ask them for advice. Make sure you look and see what else is out there and how you can emulate success, because like they show you the other projects that exist on the site. And so that can be really helpful. So just like look around and see what else is going on. And then, reach out for people to help, and then try again.
Try again, and don't be afraid to ask for help. And it sounds like you did a lot of research and that it really paid off. So lots of good advice there. So thank you, Elisabeth. Like you said, there's so many points here that we could spend hours talking about, but we have reached the hour. So
before we say goodbye, I do want to mention that the Luminaria Tarot deck, which goes with this guidebook here, that is color. Black and white illustrated deck, book and deck. There are still a few copies left. And I'm not doing a second run on it. So if you want a copy of it, go to my website, which is writingrefinery.com. And there's a link there that will take you to the shop and you can buy the deck.
Okay. And then you have another website that people can go to.
Yeah. Which one are we talking about? Are we talking
That's a hard one. It's elisabethkauffman.com.
Elisabethkauffman.com. Yeah. Sorry.
Not use that one very much.
What other website are we talking about?
Do you really just use writingrefinery.com?
No, I mean, for a long time, I've separated the two of my art and author life and my my editing life, but I think they're actually starting to merge. So if you want to look at elisabethkauffman.com, you can do that too. There's a mailing list you can sign up for their newsletter that will keep you abreast of all the things that I happen to be getting into when we come out with a new project. I say we in the royal sense because everything I'm working on from here on out right now is my own. It's not collaborative, but
the royal we is hard at work. Okay. All right. So writingrefinery.com and elisabethkauffman.com. Thank you again, Elisabeth. This was a lot of fun and I learned a lot and I love the deck, and congrats not only to you, but to Jen as well, because just beautiful, beautiful project. I am Matthew Felix. More about me at matthewfelix.com and more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, including how to register for next year's in-person, fingers crossed, conference. That is the plan in 2022, President's Day weekend, February 2022. Register for that, please, now at sfwriters.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us.